Warm welcome and turn the program over.
Thank you, Gerald, and thank you, Chuck and Ronnie, for giving us this wonderful place to have a meeting. And I greatly appreciate the opportunity to come and speak to you again. When this new administration went into office in 2009, the administration came in with promises to restore competition for independent livestock producers, promises to ensure that we had adequate food safety, adequate border protections. And so very early in that new administration, in fact in February of 2009, on behalf of our CAF members, I had a meeting one-on-one with Secretary Vilsack in his office for 1 hour. Went through a presentation with him and asked 3 requests. They said, our members want you to do 3 things in your administration. Number 1, we want you to reverse the over 30-month rule. That's the rule USDA promulgated in order to allow higher risk animals for BSE from Canada to enter the United States. The second thing we asked of him was stop and completely abandon the plans to pursue a national animal identification system. And the third thing we asked him to do was to promulgate rules to effectively address the packers' use of captive supplies that were being used to leverage down domestic cattle producer prices. Those were the 3 requests. Secretary Vilsack, when the meeting was over, said, you know, that was one of the best organized presentations I've ever received. I appreciate that. I'm going to take this presentation to my chief economist, and we will get back to you shortly. I've never heard from Secretary Vilsack or his economist regarding those 3 requests. But what has happened since that time with respect to those requests? The first thing that we recognize is that in 2010, in an unprecedented move, we had the U.S. Secretary of Agriculture and the U.S. Attorney General went around the country and held 5 workshops to determine the state of competition in the livestock industry and other agricultural industries. Unprecedented to have 2 cabinet members come to rural America and conduct these meetings. We had in Fort Collins, Colorado, perhaps the largest gathering of cattle producers ever in the United States, at least in recent memory, to talk about the problems associated with competition. But what has happened as a result of those workshops? Nothing that we can tell. What else has happened since then? Well, in 2010, one of the first things Secretary Vilsack did was announce that he was no longer going to pursue a national animal identification system. We thought we had won the issue, only to learn soon thereafter that the administration had a different plan. Somewhat of a watered-down version, but nevertheless, a first step towards a government-mandated animal identification system that will affect and cost each and every U.S. cattle producer. In the area of captive supplies, the packers' use of cattle committed to the packer that have never been priced in the marketplace, the packers are able to use those cattle in order to avoid the cash market. Thus, when cattle prices are high, they can slaughter and kill their own captive supply cattle. When prices are low, they can enter the cash market. What's the effect of that? When prices are rising, they're killing their own cattle, they're lessening demand for fed cattle, domestic cattle prices fall. When those prices fall to the level the packers are comfortable with purchasing, then they enter the cash market, and the effect of that is to remove the highs from the fed cattle market and leave you as producers only with the troughs, the low in the cycle. And so with respect to captive supplies, a couple of things have happened. Number 1, the Grain Inspection Packers and Stockyards Administration promulgated rules, at least went through the rulemaking process, in order to prevent the meat packers from engaging in unfair and deceptive practices. Essentially what that rule did was prevented the meat packers from engaging in retaliation against producers, prevented the packers from engaging in acts of bad faith and fraud against producers, all of which are the kind of conduct and behavior that are essential in order for a concentrated, dominant meat packer to capture control over the live cattle supply chain. And so if we look at the issues we're faced with today, this is a critical issue because the meat packers have very successfully deployed a model that enabled them to capture completely the entire poultry supply chain from what used to be independent poultry producers. That happened in the 60s and 70s. In the 80s and 90s, the meat packers focused on the hog industry. The hog industry, like the poultry industry, was very susceptible to vertical integration because it could be done in a relatively small geographic area and it can be done in confinement. In fact, the act of vertical integration, of capturing the livestock supply chain, is accomplished when one focuses on where the animals are concentrated. So in the hog industry, since the 1980s and 90s, we've lost 9 out of every 10 producers that were in business in 1980 are gone today. 9 out of every 10 independent hog producers. In our cattle industry, we're the last frontier. Our industry is less susceptible to the vertically integrated model, but the meat packers are pursuing it nonetheless. We are the last frontier. We are the last major protein producer that is not already captured by the meat packers. And so we look at what's left of the competitive marketplace in the fed cattle industry. We realize that in our fed cattle industry, all of us watch the cash market. We watch the cash market because we're comfortable with it in the feeder cattle market. We see many buyers and many sellers come together and bid and quibble, and as a result, a price is discovered for the value of the livestock that you own or are selling. In the fed cattle market, it's the same thing. We look at the cash market because that is the price discovery market for the entire industry. You must have price discovery in order to know what a competitive value is for the animal you're selling. So maintaining the integrity of the cash market is quintessential to ensuring open and robust competition in the cattle industry. But what has happened and what is happening in our cash market in just very recent years? If you can see this chart, the top line, this is a USDA Agricultural Marketing Service chart, and it shows the volume of cattle sold or marketed through various marketing channels. The top line is the cash market. Next line is a formula contract. These are captive supply cattle, unpriced cattle. Next line is forward contracts. The bottom is negotiated grid. In 2005, over 50%, 52% of all the fed cattle sold were sold in the cash market, so the price discovery was based on over half the cattle being sold. Last year, in 2011, that figure on a national level fell to less than 33%. Less than 33% of all the cattle are now involved in the price discovery market, and that market is becoming thinner and thinner. Now, if we look back at what happened in the hog industry as we lost 9 out of every 10 producers in just the last 30 years, what we saw is that cash market shrunk in proportion to the loss of producers. The cash market of the hog industry is pretty much non-existent today. It's been reported to be 5%, 8%, or even less at some times during the year. So nationally, the cash market for the fed cattle industry has fallen to less than 33%. But we have regional fed cattle markets. This is the Texas, Oklahoma, New Mexico market. That cash market is down to 17% last year. It was nearly 50% just 6 years ago in 2005. Look at the volume of captive supplies. Formula cattle, approximately 73% of all the cattle marketed in 2011 in Texas, Oklahoma, and New Mexico were captive supply cattle. This gives the packers tremendous leverage over that cash market. When the prices are high, they avoid the cash market. They can avoid it for a week, 10 days, 2 weeks at a time. The effect of that is, as fed cattle prices fall $2 or $3, $4 a hundredweight, then they come in and buy from the U.S. independent cattle producer. And if we look at your market area, the Colorado market, you're under 18%. Your fed cattle market in this state has fallen to less than 18%, and it was just 6 years ago, 52%. Folks, this process of vertical integration is happening and happening at an alarming rate in your industry. We've got to address this, because if we don't, we need only to look at the poultry producers, we need only to look at the few remaining hog producers and know what our fate will be. They're not trying to capture your land. They're trying to capture the feeding sector of our industry, where the fed animal is sold to the packer at the end of the live cattle supply chain. They're into their lifespan. You remove the competitiveness at that level, the dynamic competition that should occur between the feeder and the packer. Folks, they will control the marketplace for all the feeders and stockers in this industry, and they will do so in a hurry. So let's look at our feeding sector, the sector that is currently being targeted for vertical integration. Vertical integration equates with capture. The packers want to control the live cattle supply chain in the U.S. cattle industry. In 1996, the year that we began to liquidate the current size of the cattle herd, we had about 112,000 independent feeders in the United States. We've lost 35,000 of them in just 16 years. We're down to about 75,000 farmer feeders that have a capacity of 1,000 head or less. We're down to a total number of feedlots over that size of about 2,120. But let's look at who among the feeders are being targeted. This graph shows in 1996 on the left, we had about 45 large feedlots that fed over 50,000 head, had a capacity of over 50,000 head. But in the last 16 years, we see that the blue graph is the number of feedlots. We see the number of large feedlots have grown. The red line represents the number of cattle the largest feedlots market. So we see among the largest of feedlots, these include Friona, these include Five Rivers, we are seeing significant growth in our industry in the number of largest feedlots, both in terms of the number, but also in terms of the number of cattle marketed. And I went the wrong way. This one is hard to see, but what this shows is the number of cattle marketed based on the size of the feedlot. The very bottom line is in blue, shows that the number of farmer feeders with capacities of 1,000 head or less has remained relatively stable until recent years. It's begun to fall. The red line represents the mid-size feeders, and we have them in this room. Feeders who have a capacity of between 1,000 and 50,000 head. We see that red line, or excuse me, it's the green line on top. The green line is the mid-size feeders between 1,000 head and 50,000 head. We see the trend is their numbers are falling. The red line is the only sector within our feedlot sector that is growing and has been growing over the last 15, 16 years. It's the mega feedlots that are growing. The meat packers are working aggressively to capture the feeding sector of our industry. And so